everyone to this discussion co-sponsored by the journal Dialogue and the UVA Mormon Studies program. I'm Lori Maffley-Kipp, and I hold the Richard L. Bushman Chair in Mormon Studies at the University of Virginia. I want to start by thanking all those who have made this gathering possible. Many hands have been involved in it. Emily Jensen from Dialogue, who you might have met outside, has provided tremendous administrative and logistical support. The LDS Council at UVA, especially Mike Schill, who arranged for us to use this lovely Darden school space, and Jolene Bodley and Steve Bradford, who have been involved in multiple ways, arranging, organizing, and making sure things run smoothly. Thanks too to Chris Kimball and Mark Kriego for their tech support up there. It's time we began. The date was 1973, when Lester E. Bush concluded his groundbreaking dialogue article on race in the Mormon faith with that phrase, "It's time we began." 5 years later, one part of his call to re-examine the historical origins of the temple ban on those of African descent was realized when the church leadership announced the lifting of that ban, opening the way for members of all races to partake in the temple ceremonies. That was indeed an important beginning. But that momentous occasion was only the first step. As valuable as it is to celebrate that achievement nearly 50 years ago, it is even more important to continue to work towards the full realization of the notion that all are alike unto God. Pain still persists after the wound has been bandaged, and scars linger once an injury has healed. This is where the harder work begins for those who have an investment in the health and vitality of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its members. It is challenging to recognize that steps forward on issues of race entail a direct reckoning with an uncomfortable past. It's tempting to dismiss the voices that continue to feel excluded or marginalized within the community of saints, and to recognize that there are still injuries large and small that continue to be inflicted. Ending the racial ban did not end the challenges regarding race. So the question today becomes how to move forward from there. The writer John Green provides some valuable wisdom in this regard. He quoted the famous line by the poet Robert Frost that, quote, "The only way out is through," unquote. The only way out is through. But he added to it, this is John Green, "And the only good way through is together. Even when circumstances separate us, in fact, especially when they do, the way through is together." So this discussion today is premised on the idea that the LDS Church, while it has suffered wounds from a legacy of racial discrimination, as have many churches, also contains the seeds of its own recovery and its commitment to community, to talking things through, to hearing others testify, and to bearing one another's pain in order to find forward. This is where we must begin. Now, I'm honored to be led in this discussion by four very distinguished writers who have thought deeply about these issues. Our format today is as follows. We will begin by hearing from two of our panelists, followed by questions and discussions of the issues they're going to raise for us. At about 4:10, we will take a very brief break of 5 minutes, plan accordingly, and then resume at 4:15 to hear a bit about ongoing initiatives at Dialogue and UVA. At approximately 4:25, we'll begin the second half of our presentation from panelists, followed again by more time for questions and discussions. So we'll wrap it up at about 5:30. So I'm going to introduce our first two panelists who you'll hear from after me. Paul Reeve is Professor of History and Simmons Chair of Mormon Studies at the University of Utah. He is author of Let's Talk About Race and Priesthood, published by Deseret Book, and I believe there are copies of it right outside if you want to pick one up, and project manager and general editor of Century of Black Mormons, a digital history database designed to identify all known people of Black African ancestry baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints between 1830 and 1930. Alice Faulkner Burch was born to Cleo and Elwanda Faulkner and raised in Oxnard, California. She is the Director of Research and Content and a main researcher for the Sema Hadithi, Afro-American Heritage and Culture Foundation, Utah's first and only Black history organization, which focuses on research, preservation, exhibit creation, and presentations on Utah's Black history. So first, Paul.
Okay, I'm just going to share just a few slides to kind of walk you through my experiences with the issue at hand. So over 50 years since Lester Bush published his article in Dialogue. And where are we today? I'm going to frame my conversation just with a couple of big picture ideas of where at least some of the leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are at. When Elder Stephen Snow was Latter-day Saint church historian, he has said, my view is that being open about our history solves a whole lot more problems than it creates. It's a philosophy I observe in my own scholarship. We have the current president of the faith, when he was president in the first presidency, articulated to Latter-day Saints that they needed to do better at helping to root out racism. How do we root out racism if we're unwilling to examine its roots amongst Latter-day Saints? And President Russell M. Nelson articulated the notion that human beings are held accountable to God according to their actions, not according to the color of their skin. And yet the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, for roughly 130 years, did the exact opposite. So how do you root out racism if you're not willing to confront the historical roots of it? I had an experience in 2010 in my congregation in Utah when I was advisor to the Deacons Quorum. I write about it in the Let's Talk About Race and Priesthood book. The lesson manual said the topic for the lesson is the attributes of God. And one of the attributes in the lesson manual was that God is no respecter of persons. I was trying to help these 12 and 13-year-old boys understand the implications of that. And one of those young men in my class in 2010 in Bountiful, Utah, raised his hand and said, if God is no respecter of persons, then why did he curse Black people with black skin? That's 2010. That's a 12-year-old boy. Going silent does not solve the problem. That's being perpetuated to the next generation, in other words. And what I continue to hear amongst Latter-day Saints is an effort to continue to justify and explain away the racial restrictions rather than doing the work of rooting out racism and actually owning the racial past so that Latter-day Saints can stand in places of empathy. And what I included in the Let's Talk About Race book were some of those justifications I continue to hear in the 21st century. So the racial restrictions are gone for almost 50 years. And yet the justifications continue to exist, and these are the ways that Latter-day Saints seemed to justify and try to explain away rather than actually rooting out. We don't know. We don't know where the racial restrictions came from. This was the official Come Follow Me manual in 2025 for Declaration 2. And that's a direct picture of the manual. We don't know why priesthood ordination and temple ordinances were not available to church members of African descent for a time. The people on this panel have written books about why. And to simply try to dismiss it with "we don't know" is not doing the work of rooting out racism. Brigham Young said he knew. And he said he knew very forcefully. There's his speech on the 5th of February, 1852. "If there never was a prophet or apostle of Jesus Christ spoke it before, I tell you, this people that are commonly called Negroes are the children of Cain. I know they are. I know they cannot bear rule in the priesthood." How do we continue to claim we don't know when Brigham Young said he knew? Another justification I continue to hear. In the New Testament, Jesus spread the gospel in stages, first to Jews, then to Gentiles, as parallel to first to people of Euro-American ancestry, then to people of Black African ancestry. Simply no justification for this. In this last dispensation, there was no divinely appointed timeline for spreading the good news of the restoration. The Lord commanded Joseph Smith 5 times that the gospel was to be taken unto every creature. And early Latter-day Saints took that seriously. They baptized enslaved people as well as free black people. Unto every creature is the message of the restoration. There is no spreading the gospel in stages. It's just another justification to explain away rather than do the work of rooting it out. Tribe of Levi. God has always discriminated in distributing priesthood authority. Look at the tribe of Levi in the Old Testament. It's another justification I continue to hear. And this is what I write in the Let's Talk About book. The tribe of Levi welcomed the other tribes into the tabernacle. The racial restrictions kept people of black African ancestry out of the temple. These are not parallel. The tribe of Levi welcomed the other tribes into the tabernacle so that they could perform the rituals as articulated in the Old Testament. The racial restrictions barred people of black African ancestry from temple. And ordaining black men to the priesthood would have brought down the church. So who are we thinking is the church if we're using this as a justification? We're thinking it's a white church and ignoring the fact that the first black person to join the faith was 1830 in Kirtland, Ohio. And there have been Black Latter-day Saints ever since. So you're saying, if you use this as a justification, that it would have destroyed a white church. It would have destroyed a white church. And what I articulate in the book is Latter-day Saints love to quote Joseph Smith's standard of truth. No unhallowed hand could stop the work from moving forth. That's my paraphrase. Should we really believe that no unhallowed hand can stop the work from progressing and yet treating black people equally would have? Once again, these are justifications I continue to hear in the 21st century. Everyone was racist back then. They didn't know any better, is the last one. And I think it's important to understand, right, Orson Pratt was arguing against Brigham Young in 1852. He was a product of the same 19th century cultural context. And he was advocating that black men should be allowed to vote in 1852 Utah Territory. And Brigham Young responds with, we just as well give mules the right to vote as Negroes and Indians, in the same speech where he articulates the racial restriction. Both products of the 19th century context. Joseph Smith, a product of the 19th century, sanctioned the ordination of black men to the priesthood and articulated in 1840 an open racial vision for the temple at Nauvoo that was going to be constructed the following spring. So it's just false to say everyone was racist back then. They didn't know any better. Orson Pratt, Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon are articulating open racial priesthood and temples in the 19th century, and they're a product of the same cultural context. So those are the things that I continue to see operating amongst Latter-day Saints in the 21st century justifying the racial restrictions rather than doing the work that it takes to root them out. And a part of that effort is to recognize that if a black person and a white person in the 20th century received the same temple recommend interview before 1978, the white person is admitted and the black person is denied. Frida Lucretia McGee Ballou is one example. She was baptized in 1909 outside of Tylertown, Mississippi, and she waits 69 years before she's admitted into the temple 1 month following the June 1978 revelation. If you're denying a black person and admitting a white person who can answer those questions the same, that's called racism. That's called racism. So that's what I mean when I say, rooting it out requires grappling with what it looked like amongst Latter-day Saints. Thank you.
It's really unfair to have me follow Paul, but I feel sorrier for them. So I've divided mine up into 3 points that I'm going to talk about. First, I'll present my point, and then I will present my whys onto that point. Point number 1, leaders can be more aware of who they are selecting to bring into general authority leadership roles by specifically seeking out a variety of peoples. This is not racist. Why? Currently, Elder Peter Johnson is the only general authority of the African diaspora who is African American, Black American, meaning their lineage goes back to the early days of this country. Helvecchio Martins is Brazilian, Joseph W. Sitati is Kenyan, and Edward Dubé is Zimbabwean. This same pattern has followed with women leaders. Why? This is what affirmative action is, using affirmative action as a tool that is then accompanied by confirmation from the Holy Spirit that the best person has been chosen at the time is an application of the scripture to not be commanded in all things, but to seek to do good and to be anxiously engaged in a good cause. Doctrine and Covenants 58:27. Certainly being inclusive within the church, even in the selection of leaders, is being anxiously engaged in a good cause. Why? Representation matters. Ignoring African Americans in favor of Africans galvanizes the feelings that we do not matter to the leaders because they like our cousins better. Africans and African Americans recognize we are culturally, emotionally, and spiritually different. Our needs are different, and one side of the African diaspora cannot and does not speak to the needs of the other. Contrary to popular belief, not all people of African descent are the same. Why? Intentional selection of leaders is what Jesus did with an intentional emphasis on diversity, variety, and divergence. Peter was a fisherman, a common worker, no one of high importance and not known. Matthew was a tax collector, someone well known by the public, though disliked by them as well. Simon the Zealot was an anti-Roman freedom fighter. Bartholomew, or Nathaniel, was, as Jesus himself described him in John 1:47, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no guile. Paul was a big-time sinner and persecutor of Christians before his conversion to the Christ. Number 2, have mandatory racial training for all leaders at every level. Why? This training will teach leaders what racism is, that it is real, and what it looks like on a ward level, stake level, and overall church level. Since most European Americans, Europeans, and Africans have no experience with racism, such training is crucial for leaders to understand what non-white European Americans experience within the church. Example 1, ward level. Being told, I do not belong. Example number 2, stake level. My hand not being shaken while all those around me are. Example number 3, overall church level. Lack of representation. Where in general leadership is the African American woman raised in the projects by poor parents who watched Pastor Frederick Price each Sunday to study the Bible, danced with Soul Train, and screamed over Elvis? Where among the current apostles is the African American man who was raised in a non-member home, who found his way to the church during his first marriage because he thought the church could help him be a good dad and have a good marriage, whose first marriage ended in divorce, then married a second time too hastily, who asked God for guidance to marry the right woman for him and married a third time, a man filled with wisdom, understanding, and insight gained from personal life experience. Unless they've changed it, and I've not been paying attention, divorced men are not allowed to hold leadership positions. Why? Talk is cheap until followed by action. People will say anything, but we do what we mean. And point number 3, support African American members of the U.S. as much as they support with resources, finances, etc., those African Americans who are not members of the church, and as much as they support members on the African continent and Africans living in the U.S. Why? There has been selectivity by ethnicity. This selectivity has excluded African Americans of the U.S. in favor of other black people. This has led to large numbers of black Americans leaving the church because it is a way of telling us that we are not wanted, not welcomed, and not acceptable. Why? It appears to be the easiest path for the church leaders to ignore real needs because it is too hard. It also points to the idea that black Americans, especially in Utah, have access to resources that African Americans and Africans outside Utah and the U.S. do not. This attitude shows that it is easy to ignore our needs. My conclusion. In John 13:34, Jesus revealed the new commandment on love. A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another as I have loved you, that ye also love one another. Paul demonstrated how Jesus loves us in the parable of the body in 1 Corinthians 12, verses 12 through 27. If the foot shall say, because I am not the hand, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? If the whole body were an eye, where were the hearing? If the whole were hearing, where were the smelling? Those members of the body which we think to be less honorable, upon these we bestow more abundant honor. This parable explains that no one single person or group of people are more important than another in the Church of Christ. It teaches the way to unity within the church. It emphasizes mutual care, individual to individual, and it explains that all spiritual gifts are needed in the community of the church, on the ward level, the stake level, and the general church level.
We have some time for questions, and I'm going to get us started with a few questions for our panelists first. I'm interested in hearing from each of you. Paul, you talked more about the sort of specifics of this historical legacy, and I wonder if, and you sort of alluded to the fact that there are also possibilities to find resources for change in the past. And I wonder if you want to highlight some of those that you found most effective in talking to people about this history. Where are the effective kinds of ways of sort of recovery of the past that can be useful going forward?
Sure. Part of the motivation for the Century of Black Mormons project is simply this. So some of you might be aware, Jacob Rue, a professor of sociology at BYU, did a 2025 study of Black Latter-day Saints in the contemporary Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And one of the findings from his research is simply that knowing about Black Latter-day Saint pioneers can help retention in the 21st century. Knowing that Black people had a past in this faith is one of the findings that one way that the past can be helpful in the present. I actually, in case this came up, brought some stats that stuck out to me. So Professor Rue asked me to come to BYU and respond to the study when they presented it for the first time, and I was struck by some of the percentages that his study brought forth versus what we're finding in the Century of Black Mormons database. He's studying live people, I'm studying dead people. It's difficult, right, to match everything up in terms of the research approach, and yet it's really stuck out to me. In 2025, his study showed that 57% of his group were converts and 43% were raised as Latter-day Saints. Then he uses a point of comparison to the Jesse Embry and Alan Cherry sample from 1985 to 1989. In that data set, 87% of those 21 and over were converts. If you include those who were baptized from age 9 to 21, it goes up to 97% were converts. In the Century of Black Mormons database, for the first 100 years, we have 63% who were converts and 37% who were raised Latter-day Saints. What this study bears out, in my estimation, is we lost an entire generation. In the Century of Black Mormons database, we have 5 generations of descendants of Jane Manning James, for example. 5 generations of Elijah Abel's descendants, 5 generations who received the priesthood before June 1978. But as these racial restrictions take hold at the beginning of the 20th century, that in 1908, Joseph F. Smith says, stop actively seeking people of Black African ancestry for conversion. It becomes known as a white church deliberately. And so one of the ways in which the past can help in the present, I think, is recovering these Black Latter-day Saint pioneers, not suggesting that, okay, because they joined a faith that still had, racial policies, that somehow everything was hunky-dory. Oh, see, there's a Black Latter-day Saint, there is nothing to worry about. That's not the message. Acknowledge the racism, but also acknowledge that these people chose this faith in their life, and that can help produce change in the present.
May I comment on that?
Absolutely.
In Jake Rue's study, he also found that the majority, I am so sorry. In Jake Rue's study, he also found that the majority of Black Americans who were baptized into the church, I don't know if it included the ones who were raised as well, but the ones who joined, who converted into the church, remained regardless of learning after being baptized about the racial restriction that existed if they did not learn about it beforehand. And this is also what is found in the Century of Black Mormons. And so when Paul presented the slide that that said from Come Follow Me, that help me remember the language, please.
We don't know.
Yeah, the we don't know, but there are those who exercised their faith in God and remained faithful. but some did not, or something like that. I can't remember the verbiage, something like that. That implies that those people who chose to leave the church because there was nothing for them, because they were not accepted, because they were not treated well, did not have faith in God. There is a difference between faith in God and Jesus Christ and faith in a person or an institution. Those people chose to leave an institution. Who says they ever left God? Of the people that I have studied from Century of Black Mormon, because I only do Utah Black history, but I read some of the others too. The majority of those that I have read about that Paul and his researchers have found for Century of Black Mormons remained with God. If they left the church, they still remained with God. That is a difference.
Please.
Well, I'll just add, because I brought the numbers, just so in the Century of Black Mormons database, we try to, did they die a Latter-day Saint? And one of the ways that we try to do this, find an obituary. If their funeral is held in a Latter-day Saint chapel, for example, we count that as remaining a Latter-day Saint. So in the database, 55% are verifiable remaining a Latter-day Saint from their baptism till their death. We have another 27% that we have to mark as unknown. We can't verify whether they're a Latter-day Saint or another faith at the time of death. So that 55% could be as high as 82%. And only 18% experience what we call a faith transition. And the majority of those, like Alice is pointing out, are joining another Christian denomination. Typically Black Baptist or AME, African Methodist Episcopal, are the two that are emerging as the dominant faith, that if you leave Latter-day Saint as a Black Latter-day Saint, you join AME or Black Baptist. Choosing God is the point, and the evidence that we are finding bears this out.
Vina, please.
So my work looked at global Mormonism and focusing on Indian diaspora and also a mix of African countries. And we're seeing, we don't have data because it's so vast, but from my oral history interviews, from conversations with many of Latter-day Saints who left the tradition, we're seeing very similar things happening. Many of them who had come from a Christian background, converted to the church, and also then found out about the restriction, didn't necessarily have a problem with this, because they would tell you, well, we come from a Christian background, we know this history's been there from other Christian denominations, but it's the racism that lingers in present day that makes them want to leave. And oftentimes they do leave and they will go back to their previous religious tradition, or they will find another Christian denomination. And in terms of members who are coming from a Hindu background, they will often go back to Hinduism. And so we're seeing very similar trend when we talk about racism in the church globally.
Let's open it to questions. Yes, first you.
Yeah, I was curious, is this part of the LDS church, is it restricted to African Americans? Because I know my grandparents were missionaries to Maori people in New Zealand in the 30s, and so I wondered if there was ever any of the same restrictions on Polynesians, or did it affect where missionaries were sent in the early part of the church, or is it very specific to African American?
So I'll weigh in on this, and then Matt might want to correct me if I'm wrong or add something. So 1853, first mission to South Africa. So unto every creature is taken seriously, right? Mission to Jamaica, 1853. Brigham Young, is sending missionaries. There's no, so Professor Christopher Jones at BYU studied that mission to Jamaica. No evidence that they were aware of a racial restriction. It doesn't show up in any of those missionaries' diaries or journals, right? This restriction, it takes time for it in fits and starts to solidify. That's why I suggest it's not firmly in place until the early 20th century under Joseph F. Smith. I think he's as much responsible for its solidification as Brigham Young for its beginning. And they are sending missionaries around the globe in the 1850s. And then they reopened the mission in South Africa at the turn of the 20th century. And they are again baptizing people of Black African ancestry. So, you know, but there are restrictions by then, and there are no restrictions for other people. So under President David O. McKay, for example, Black Fijians, Filipino Negritos, Australian Aborigines, all ordained to the priesthood. As they sort of refine their understanding, it's if you can trace to African ancestry. DNA wasn't available, right? And so they are operating under sort of their understanding at the time of what that actually means.
How about like Chinese Americans? Because there was so much anti-Chinese feeling post the gold rush, but there was actually a pretty large population of China. Did that ever come into place as well, or was?
Not in terms of priesthood restriction, certainly racism, yes, but not in terms of ever being denied priesthood restriction. Same for Native Americans. That's seen as a fulfillment of the Book of Mormon promise when Native Americans are given the priesthood and admitted to the temple. And that happens in Nauvoo. And church leaders are celebratory of that. We are fulfilling the promise of the Book of Mormon in their minds, right? So they make a distinction, and it's only people of Black African ancestry that they apply the restrictions to.
Yeah, just one thing to comment. So, I mean, Paul's right. It's just persons who trace their ancestry back to Africa. But there is a racial component dealing with brown people, and that is this notion that everybody was born white, and then certain of God's children were cursed, and that in order to live with God again in the celestial kingdom, they have to have that reversed. And so that's one of those uncomfortable things that the church has struggled with. Some of the apologetic groups that have popped up at my alma mater, BYU, coalesced around that whole idea that racial curse really is symbolic of your soul. But that's just not borne out by the evidence. The evidence is that Latter-day Saints, much like Protestants, believe that there'd be an actual change in your skin color if you comported in certain ways. And one quick story. 1960, Spencer Kimball was the last church leader to really address this in a general conference. And it was Chris is back in the corner there. And I was talking to Chris's dad years ago. So Chris Kimball is Spencer Kimball's grandson, those of you who don't know. And I was talking to Ed Kimball, who's also the biographer of his father. And I said, tell me about that 1960 sermon. He said, oh, my father wished he could have that one back. I said, I bet. Because they got a plethora of I was going to say emails, but that doesn't work. They got a plethora of letters in 1960 saying, how does this work, Elder Kimball? And, you know, you can't really articulate this because it's just built on a racial fiction. So, but anyway, that's how I think black and brown people were brought in together under this racial umbrella, is through that whiteness theology.
Yes, you're next.
Yes. So you'd mentioned some general authority statements. Have general authorities spoken about racism, especially with any specificity, since November 2024?
I don't remember any. No, the last one I remember was President Hinckley, when he said in General Conference to deny or treat the priesthood of one man differently because his skin color is different is I can't remember the exact verbiage. It's abominable. It isn't right. It is a sin. Something like that. That's the last one I remember.
Well, then you have President Nelson and President Oaks.
Right.
During Black Lives
In
Matter.
2020.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
Are you
just
referring to something?
Yeah, I was going to say, in response to that, a lot of people stopped talking about racism after November 5th, 2024.
mean they were talking and stuff.
Yes,
So
that's the presidential election.
It seems like in countries that have a British colonial past, the United States, Australia, South Africa, there's real rigid racial lines. And there's just as much racism in Latin America and whatever, but the racial lines are a lot more fuzzy and blurry. Did the church enforce this racist ban in Latin America? And if they did, how did you determine? Because the racial lines, even though there's just much racism, the racial lines are a lot more fuzzy and blurry in Latin America. So how did they enforce this racist ban there, if they did?
They attempted to. They were in a variety of Latin American countries, an additional lesson. So if you approach a door and you perceive the person has Black African ancestry because of the racial mixing, you move on. Or if you are teaching them there's an additional lesson that is developed, you ask them, if you come to discover that you have Black African ancestry, will you let your local leaders know? And then in some cases, they released a branch president who found out as branch president that he had African ancestry. But they are definitely baptizing and ordaining and, all of that without knowledge that we know now because of DNA, right? People with much more than one drop, and that was the standard put in place in 1907, one drop, like the nation. Virginia, 1924, adopted a one-drop law to legally define who they could segregate. So, and the LDS Church followed in that trend, right, after Plessy versus Ferguson, and it adopted its one-drop policy in 1907. So, in other words, they attempted to do so in very awkward and racial ways.
Can I just add to that? People became, so when the 4-generation requirement was given, it actually started, correct me if I'm wrong, okay, in South Africa. And the missionaries were told, the mission president was told, you're to do this with all of the people there because there was so much mixing and they couldn't tell who had one drop and who did not. Those of the lighter skin. And so they had them do a 4-generation sheet, and anybody who could trace their genealogy within the 4 generations to African descent, Black African descent, they were then denied the priesthood. They could not advance. They could not go to the temple, etc., etc. Well, people began catching on to what was going on. And even though the church was enforcing this to be done, there were families who found out and they actually left South Africa and moved to Utah because in Utah, nobody could tell. And they soon learned that. And one of the examples is Bessie Ritchie Rogers, Elizabeth Bessie Ritchie Rogers, the daughter of Nelson Holder Ritchie, a Black American man who formerly enslaved, who was married to a white American woman, and so their children were both. Bessie Ritchie Rogers was the first African American woman to enter the temple, the Salt Lake Temple, and to do ordinances there, as well as to work there as an ordinance worker. So there were ways around it. People found ways around it. The church thought they were enforcing it, the leaders did, but it could not be enforced. And the stories that Paul and his researchers are finding through Century of Black Mormons are proving that it could not be enforced. It was impossible to enforce it.
Or can I just
Yes.
patriarchal blessings were a big one too. So some of the leaders wanted to put the onus of lineage detection or lineage boundaries on patriarchs. You can imagine the apprehension that would have, because what's at stake here, right? Your eternal salvation, your ability to go to the temple. And so some of the patriarchs felt tremendous apprehension, and they refused to give lineage, even though they believed that the person for whom they were delivering the blessing was black and probably they believed that we're cursed. But they would declare no lineage, which is a problem, right, in LDS theology, because you're supposed to give lineage. Another thing they struggled with is that they would pronounce the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which are temple blessings, and that's a problem for obvious reasons. This is pre-1978. And then finally, they would then do, the most bold thing. They would tell them that they were the lineage of Cain or Ham or Canaan, which is problematic because a blessing is supposed to give you guidance, make you feel good, and then you walk away being told that your lineage is that of a biblical counterfigure. And so, anyway, there are letters between the brethren, or among the brethren, about do we put this kind of pressure on patriarchs to discern lineage? And in one instance, one of the apostles, Mark Peterson, he told a patriarch, he said that if you feel inspired to give this person a cursed lineage, then they can't go to the temple, they can't go on a mission. But if you do feel inspired, then that allows them to go on a mission and get married in the temple and all of that. And the patriarch wrote back and he said, I'm feeling a lot of pressure. And, understatement. But that was the challenge they were in by boxing themselves in this corner with the lineage and some of these racial curses.
Thank you.
That gentleman right there had his hand up. You, who just turned around.
Oh, wow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to start with a statement. I want to start with a statement that put everybody at ease, right? Because I'm a brown guy here, and everyone's like, oh, okay, here comes the bomb thrower, and I don't want that to be the case, right? And the statement is, I'm Afro-Latino, Afro-Caribbean. There's a difference, right, as you've mentioned. Afro-Caribbean means that the slaves of my ancestry came from Jamaica and Barbados, and there's a different relationship between the white owners and the enslaved people than in the United States. So that means that my experience with racism is not only fundamentally different than that with an African American, it is extremely unique in the church. And for those who aren't tracking what that means is that black people don't like me just as much as white people. Okay? Right? Because I don't speak like an African American. My culture, my traditions, everything of the food that I eat, the way my family gathers is very different. It's Caribbean. And I don't know any different. So when I'm a young man, I don't know that I am different. All I know is, geez, everybody hates me unless they're in my physics class in which they like me, right? So, that being said, I joined the church in 1980, having no idea about the racist thing. Zero. Okay? I just went to, I was a Catholic before, and I joined when I was 11. All right? So I didn't know, and I made a choice. It wasn't my mom made me do it. I did it because my family was doing it. For the first time, missionaries were answering questions for me that Catholic priests couldn't answer. And I was impressed, and I wanted more of that in my life. Now, I say this because, for two big reasons. One, everything you're talking about, I lived through. I am actually struggling with rage right now and struggling with PTSD right now, right? Because I'm listening to this. Everything here is academic, and I appreciate the academic approach. I really, really do. But for me, it's not academic. It's emotional, right? It is. It goes even down towards my children who are mixed race, right? I went to Hawaii to get married. No, that's not true. I was stationed in Hawaii first. Thank you. She's not my war bride. No, that's not like that at all. But my point is I knew that I couldn't go to church in the continental United States and find a bride. All right, I knew that. And so I placed myself out of it. My 4 children, 3 of them started in the BYU system. Only 1 graduated, and he looks the most like his mother. So I say all this to, A, reduce everybody's anxiety, if you come and approach me, I am not going to explode. I do appreciate opportunities to speak about this because it's rare that I have an opportunity to actually talk about my experience. I have to be silent about it in church. I have the, now to my question. I mean, I say that, a long preamble, and I do that to hopefully put everybody at ease. When you look at the population of the United States, the population of African Americans in the United States is about 10 to 12%. You get 14%. All right. The population of African Americans, those who were born in the United States and trace their lineage to probably an enslaved person in the United States, in the church, is between 1 and 3%. And it isn't just because of the history. Because my mom knew about the history. She was born in Panama. She was born in Panama and had actually approached the church because it was close to the church that she went to in Panama, a Barbadian church in Panama. And she wanted that for her children and was pushed away. And then when the missionaries came back, it's a long story. I won't tell you. I'll tell you the joke if you want to get up and talk about it later. But she wanted to go, and she chose to go and chose to stay with the church, even regardless of the mission, regardless of the history. But my understanding and my interpretation of why such a small percentage of African Americans do not join the church is because of current racist thoughts that get exposed even during the lessons. To wit, would be when I've been in many bishoprics, let me just say it like that, right? And never a bishop, but many bishoprics. That's another story. But a missionary approaching me saying, and they're teaching a young black man, an African American, and they're asking me, they want to know what we think about the priesthood. And my response to them is, they don't want to know what I think. They want to know what you think, right? If you ask them for me to tell them what I think, I'm going to tell them, and you're not going to like it, right? And because it's going to be contrary to what the church says. But you need to go figure that out. I'm not going to help you with this. And that young African American man walked away. I don't want him to walk away, but I'm also not going to lie to him. All right? Nor am I going to stop sustaining my leaders, which puts me in a really freaking weird position. Okay? So I ask, is my instinct wrong there? Is there more there? What does the academic side say to that? And I think you've already kind of said that, but I need to hear again.
Can I tell you what scriptures say to that? There is a scripture, and I don't remember where in Doctrine and Covenants, that speaks to if a person has the truth and the opportunity to share it, it is your responsibility to share it. And I would say to you, if you hold truth and somebody comes to you and asks you for that, that then becomes your opportunity to share it with that person. Who knows what door is closed when we do not share truth with somebody? Who knows what doors are opened when we do share truth with somebody? I will tell you that one big way that I have acquired truth is by reading these men's books. I've acquired a lot of truth about the past, and the saying that truth shall set you free, I do feel set free because I know what the truth is. I'm no longer held bound by falsehoods, by the precepts of men. When I sit in a class and something erroneous is said, if I feel like it, if I feel that I can handle the ensuing pressure or disagreement or negative energy that will rise up, I will say something. I will say, no, that is incorrect. This is the truth of that. Go to whatever. And sometimes I do not. But the truth that I hold has set me free from the falsehoods that are said today, that were said in the past, and that continue to be perpetuated by the young. And that's what really bothers me, is that even today, in 2026, what is it, 172 years later, the young people, young men, young women, are perpetuating the falsehoods.
Could I just hear from two, I'm sorry to put it this way, but what he just said was answered by, and I don't know if you noticed, but the two white men looked at the black woman for the answer. Why is that? What did the two white gentlemen, very respectfully, have to say? I've read your books. I know you're good people with good hearts. What do you have to say for that? There is one additional thing that I will add. Last week I happened to be in Seattle, and it so happened the presiding bishop was there and visiting the ward at the same day. And he didn't know me, didn't know my name, didn't know who I was. I was a visitor, and I thought this is my perfect opportunity to go up and ask an anonymous question. And I asked him, quite frankly, why has there been no apology? I understand there's been a change, certainly in 1978 a change was made. Why has there been no apology to African Americans for the racism in the church? And he actually said, I don't know. He did try to point to black people have been called as general authorities by white men, trying to point that out, how good that is. And I couldn't get anything out of him except he said, you just need to look forward. And I said, so we just need to forgive? And he said, yeah, just look forward. Don't look backward. I couldn't get an answer out of the presiding bishop. Why has there been no apology? And I hate the spot. You're white men, though. What do you have to say to my husband who has said this? You can't go silent. You're authors. What do you have to say?
Yeah, no. Thanks for the follow-up, and thank you for sharing. I looked at Alice because I love and respect Alice, and I knew if she wanted me to go first, she would say, Paula, you take this. I have that kind of relationship with Alice. So I wanted to give her an opportunity. I wasn't, not afraid to speak on this. So thank you for what you shared. Right, it really touched me. So this is just my perspective. I'm just some dude who has written on this, but nonetheless, I'm also sort of navigating kind of, the same kind of questions, but from the vantage point of a white male in the 21st century. What you said is absolutely right. If you misrepresent to a person the feelings of betrayal, when they do find out, because they will find out, are, in my estimation, worse.
Yeah.
And if people listen to Peter Johnson, he mentioned in his General Conference address his own experience with that feeling of betrayal as a missionary when he first found out. We did a conference at the University of Utah where he was on a panel. I would recommend people to watch this. It's available. He developed that much more in depth than his General Conference address, and it was painful, his feelings of betrayal. So I have to say, absolutely, you tell the truth and let the people decide, use their agency to make the decision, an informed decision rather than a decision that misshapes the truth. Absolutely is how I would approach it. And I've approached it that way when I've had those opportunities. That's my answer. I just don't think you can somehow shade or, put lipstick on a pig in this situation. You just can't. You have to just own it. That's the whole point of Let's Talk About Race and Priesthood, right? Like, own it. Right. We participated in racism. We experienced a soft form of it. What better people then to stand in places of empathy and move forward in leading out? But to the answer that you got, right, ignore it and move forward, that's not rooting out racism. That's not rooting out racism. That perpetuates the problem.
Vina, did you have something you wanted to?
So as an islander, I get it, because Mauritius is a mix of Indian, African, we call Creole people. We're all mixed. And one of the things that members of the church in Mauritius, because the church came after the lifting of the ban on the island officially. And when I was talking to a friend just recently about this from Mauritius, what were the conversations around when they learned about the ban? Many of them said they were not surprised because this is what people who are European, whether they were coming as Catholic priest or Protestant evangelical on the island, this is what was happening. So many people will tell you globally from these different perspectives that they were not surprised. They were not offended about it, and so to speak. But what they do have a problem is the hiding, is not telling the truth. And like a friend said, when we ask, they will say to us, well, we didn't know. The leaders didn't know. They didn't have the revelation. I mean, these are all the examples that Paul gave, the different justifications. And then what my friend said, and this is what I found out, is, but we all know. We all do. And so even though that they got this reply from leaders, whether they were a bishop or a mission president that would oftentimes an American, they would smile and say, but we do know that was racist. You're just not telling us in our face, but we do know. And I think this is where senior church leaders have kind of missed the ball on this, is people are not naive. And there's an assumption that Latter-day Saints of color are naive and that they will just go with it. No, we have had our testimony and we are coming despite all of the stuff that we know. That's the bigger picture. And so when we hear things like that, is we often smile and we will just say, okay, not ready to address it, but by the way, we know. You're not fooling us. We're very aware of it.
So we have to stop to take a break. I know there are many, many questions out there. Hold your questions. We will have much more time for discussion after our next panel. But right now, we're going to take a very quick 5-minute break and then come back in for more conversation. Thank you. Thank you. All right, back to the discussion. I'm here to introduce the next two panelists, and then we will move into the Q&A again. Our first panelist, Veena Chauriyama, is a PhD candidate in religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her work on global Mormonism examines how the Latter-day Saint faith intersects with Indian cultural identity in Mauritius, while her current dissertation explores devotion to the Lady of, I'm going to get the name wrong, Vilankani, an Indian Marian devotion in Mauritius as a space where Indo-Mauritian and Creole Catholic women negotiate and reshape religious, ethnic, and cultural boundaries. Then we will be hearing from Matt Harris, who is a professor of history at Colorado State University, Pueblo, and the author of the recently published book, Second Class Saints, Black Mormons and the Struggle for Racial Equality. He is currently finishing a biography, which we are all dying to see, of progressive Mormon apostle Hugh B. Brown, which will be published in 2027. So, Veena?
All right, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Well, vanakkam, this is the salutation in Tamil for my people. I'm a South Indian, very proud South Indian woman, an islander, and culturally Catholic, and a Latter-day Saint. So those are part of my identities of who I am, and I'm a scholar. I wanted to start this this conversation on race and global Latter-day Saint. So this year I'm teaching a world religion class at UNC Chapel Hill. And when we got into the section of global Christianities, we talked about Mormonism. And I started this story with my students, and I said, well, here we have a church, American born, and nowadays more members live outside of the US. So what does that say about this church? What are some conversation around it? And we also talked about a story that I wanted to get them to grasp the main conversation surrounding Latter-day Saint faith. And so here you go. My two aunts, Marlene and Monique Padiachi, they met the missionaries in France around 1977, late 1977 in Strasbourg, France. And there they were taught by sister missionaries. They prayed about the Book of Mormon, they prayed about the church, and felt strongly that they should be baptized. So around February 1978, the baptism date was set up, and they had their interviews with two elders for their baptism, which is very common. And I'm showing you a picture of Mauritius, and you get an idea as I'm talking about this. And after they did their baptismal interview, the last question was, do you sustain and accept that people of color, black people and people of color, are from the blood of Cain? This was part of their interview for their baptism. Now, they had their baptism interview separately. The youngest sister, Monique, she said, I paused and I thought, wait a minute, we've never talked about this thing throughout the discussion of the missionaries. What was it that they were talking about, referring to? And so she asked a little bit, and they explained about it. And then she remembered growing up as an Indian Catholic on the island, my grandma, her mom, would always say, "Nu tuban madras, nu disonkae," meaning South Indian who are Catholic because they are dark and have curly hair, they are from the blood of Cain. And so this, I wanted to connect this because Paul also talked about that, and Matt, how many of Christian denominations were using this as putting people down, people of color down because of the blood of Cain. And so she said, I remembered what my mom said, and she's always talked about it. And I thought, well, it must be true because mom said it. Now these two young American elders, they're saying the same thing. It must be true. And so she said yes. And she was baptized. When I told this story in my class, I started with that story, talking about global Mormonism. Most of my students are from North Carolina. They are Caucasian. They come from Christian background. And I could see their faces, how they were appalled by it. And in their mind, they were asking themselves, well, why would two women of color join a church like this? What was the point? And so this is the conversation that we're going to have. In terms of Mauritius, we have a mix of people. We have Indians, Creoles. Part of the Indians are also Muslim, and some of them are Catholics, and Creoles and Franco-Mauritian, and then Chinese. So it's a very mixed island, 1.2 million of people. And I think I look at it as a case study of what global Mormonism will look like when we think about cosmopolitan societies. Because it's not just Mauritius, it's happening everywhere. Latter-day Saint faces in Europe, in Latin America, in many places in the US, it's changing. The colors are changing, the races are changing. And when we talk about the priesthood ban, and I did not know the history of the African American Latter-day Saints, not until I moved to the US. I knew the stories about the lifting of the ban and the priesthood ban in terms of a global perspective. And as I've mentioned previously, they kind of glossed over it, and it was also, we would say it's in the past, and we would move on. But members of color outside of the United States are still grasping at those questions, and they see the racism still prevalent in the church. What I mean by that, because you're probably thinking, okay, we have many countries in Africa where the church is booming, so the leadership, members, everybody looks black. So what are you talking about? Or even in Mauritius. One of the things that we have seen, and we still see it, and I'm starting to see it also in the US, is there's a very much of welcome for people of color in the church. But when it comes to leadership, even then I would say yes, we're invited to the table as long as we know the rules and as long as we play by the rules. And to me, it's more of a idea, this is how we do church in the United States, and it has worked for us. We're gonna do the same thing outside. And that's where the tension comes in. For members of color who has been in leadership in many of these countries, they often feel that because they don't have a pioneer heritage, they are converts, they don't know enough. They don't have enough experiences. So they constantly need to be taught. They constantly need to be trained. And even when they're trained, there is much love for the saints, but the trust in leadership is not there. And that's a big difference. I do think our senior leaders and those who come and help saints of color everywhere, they do have a profound love. But trusting is a different thing. And that I don't see it. So for example, when I did my oral history interviews in Mauritius, we would have members telling me that the mission president, oftentimes, who is American or of a European descent, will be the one overseeing the area, which is, depending how it's set up, that makes sense. But they don't listen to the leaders, the local leaders. And I'm also gonna say, local leaders, people of color, are also afraid to speak up. This is my legacy of colonialism. I come with that. And I've had to be in many uncomfortable places to be able to learn how to speak up. And I think those two things together then create this parent-child relationship where I feel and I see leaders who are coming from Salt Lake, they still feel like a parent and they're still trying to raise the child. And we as people of color, also then, because of our legacy, there's a tension, there's a struggle, and those are legit. In the book that Desmond Tutu wrote, titled, what was it? No Future Without Forgiveness. And when Alice was speaking today, and I've often had this reflection that the African American experience is very so much connected with South African, Black South Africans when we think about the apartheid. And when he wrote this book, he talks about how it was his first time going to a conference in one African countries, I forgot which one, and they had been independent for longer than South Africa, and the pilots were black. He gets on this airplane, and the pilots are black, and here he comes from South Africa, the apartheid South Africa, and he is so proud of it. He's like, look at this. They're pilots. They're doing things for their own. This is their country.
And when he gets on the plane, as the plane starts to hit turbulence, he starts to freak out. And he says to himself, do these black guys know what they're doing? Do they even know? And he tells this story because he wants to remind us that we have people who've been colonized for centuries. We have this mentality behind all the time. And the interesting thing is, when I went and did my oral history interviews, my research in Mauritius in 2019, I had been in the US, I've been living in the US since 2001. I went with my brother and I got on the plane, Air Mauritius, and it was a smaller plane. And I remember thinking, wait, we're gonna do 12 hours on this plane? And I started to freak out. And I saw the pilots, and they were Mauritian, they were Creole and Indian, and I freaked out more. And when the plane hit turbulences, I had the same reaction as Desmond Tutu. And I had read that book several years ago. And yet, that was my first instinct. I kept looking, even though I couldn't see the pilots, but like, do they know what they're doing? We're gonna die, we're just gonna die. I'm not even gonna make it to my research. But I wanna tell you this because in Mauritius, at that time, when I was traveling, I've always seen only white pilots. It's always been, our government would only hire European or South African white pilots. And so for me to see this big change, it threw me off. And I didn't have confidence in these two men. And so there's a paradox when we talk about racism in the church. It's we have leaders who treat us like we're children, who also think we're naive, and at the same time, we have to fight that colonialism mentality to be able to speak up and be able to stand up for what we think is unfair. All right. Can I just do one more?
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to tell you one more story, and this is with what our previous two speakers have talked about. Okay. Just read this little, okay, did it go through? Oh, let me see. Okay, this one. All right. So, I have 3 kids. I mean, they're teenagers and college now, but I bought the Book of Mormon stories for them growing up. And we love that book. And every time there was that chapter, you know what I'm talking about, what I'm referring to, I would just skip that page and we'll keep moving on. I wanted my kids to learn about the Book of Mormon. That's why I did it. I'm a Latter-day Saint. It's part of my faith. I own it. I don't have any problem with that. And several years later, these books had just been in my house. My daughter was in middle school. We were living in Utah at that time. And she came to me crying. And she said, "Mom, does God hate me? Did he curse me because of my skin? Because I'm a brown girl?" This was 2018. And 2017, 2018. And I said, "What are you referring to?" And she said, "Well, I just, came across the book. I was reading it because I've always loved it. And I read that part that says they were cursed because of their skin color." And I remember thinking, how do I address this? As a mother, a woman of color, as also a scholar, and as a Latter-day Saint. And to me, when you read this direction, this is the description of the book. It's a colorful, illustrated stories from the Book of Mormon are written on a basic reading level. This book helps parents and teachers teach the scriptures to children. They can share the testimonies and encourage children to seek their own testimonies. I agree with all of that. But I also know we're asking children of color to understand this complicated matter that we adults are still grappling with. And we're expecting them to read this as if it's normal. And so one of the things that I hope senior leaders will understand is it's not easy for people of color. It's never been easy, and we stay despite that. But we're also saying we want changes. We want meaningful changes. Saying in general conference, don't be a racist, it's not enough. It's just not enough. We've had many materials that have been published on the church website, and I recognize that. The essay and many things on the priesthood. Those are great, but they're hidden on the church website. So it's not that they're right there for members to be taught. And I also think senior leaders, this is coming from a global perspective. There's a fear that if we talk about racism, then everything else is going to fall apart. I see all the great things that they're doing in terms of interfaith. I see all the things that they're doing in terms of the website and the church. But I also see that, like these other speakers have said, until we address it, we're just going to play this gymnastic game with racism. And we have youth, we have young people nowadays, they don't put up with those things anymore. They want answers, they want to talk about it. And so I understand when church leaders are uncomfortable, because many of them are European descent, many of them have pioneer heritage, because then you also have to look with your own family, your own genealogy, when you're talking about racism in the church. But they are not my triggers. These are triggers that people who have heritage pioneer have to deal with, and traumas. They're not mine. Don't get me wrong, Global Latter-day Saints, we have others. But that one is not ours. And so that's also why we are much more comfortable to talk about it. We're not afraid to speak about it. That's where I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I just want to say it's a privilege being with my friend Alice again, and Vina for the first time, and Lori for the first time, and Paul for the umpteenth time. And I just admire these folks, and we learn from each other, and it's an incredible experience. So 2 years ago, I was at a conference, and a friend of mine came up to me at the conference, and he said, it was the Mormon History Association conference, and he said, you need to meet a friend of mine, so my friend's friend. She's a retired BYU professor. She's probably in her early 80s, and she's best friends with Dallin Oaks. I said, okay, you got me. I'll drop what I'm doing. And so anyway, I went over, and he made the introduction, and some of you heard me on podcasts. I don't mince words. How do you know Dallin Oaks? Well, we served together at BYU. I was in his cabin. I was a professor of English. When's the last time you saw him? 2 nights ago. How do you see him? What's the relationship? He likes my cooking. And I said, okay. She said that his wife and he, they come to my house ever so often, and I cook for them. And I said, well, what do you talk about? Well, whatever he wants to talk about. Well, what did you talk about 2 nights ago? And MAGA's hurting the church. And I said, what did you say? Nothing. I just let him talk. He needs to talk. And so I thought about that experience. MAGA is hurting the church. He's talking about MAGA. That was what was on President Oaks' mind in the moment. He wasn't church president. This would have been 2 years ago. So he would have been the most senior apostle, or second most senior apostle behind President Nelson. And so MAGA's hurting the church, is what he said. And then probably 3 or 4 days later, a poll came out in which 42% of Latter-day Saints, at least in Utah, maybe it was Utah, I think, maybe it was nationally, I don't remember. But 42% of Latter-day Saints identified as white Christian nationalists. And, you know, we're talking about race today, and Lori framed this nicely about what does race look like post-1978, driven by political racism. We've got data on this, so I'm not going to spout on or pontificate or theorize. Most people in the church today, I'm careful how I generalize here, but most are not going around, you know, the curse and the less valiant, and we've got some data on that. In a younger generation, they're not raised with that sort of thinking. This is post-78. But yet the racism is still there, and it's driven by politics. Political identities are driving religious identities. And so how do we look at that? What do we do, particularly when the senior church leadership, as Vina puts it, and I think Alice and Paul referred to this, sometimes they're not as vocal as one would like. And what I thought about is some of my own experiences in which most of this is being done in regional, at state levels, wards and branches. I'm seeing this all the time. Let me give you a few examples. There's a Latter-day Saint man who started a podcast in the state of Washington during COVID. It was a way to keep the community together. And I think it started out maybe 20, 30 people. Then it sort of mushroomed into 100, 120 people. And they're still doing it. And I remember him reaching out to me, asking me to do something with his podcast. And I said, does your stake president know about this? I am the stake president. Okay. Good to know. Anyway, so I said, who's the audience? I want to be careful, right, what I say. And I understand, these things could be challenging for some folks. Maybe this is a dialogue crowd, more liberal than usual. So, but anyway, who's your audience? And we have a range of people, he said. Some Orthodox Latter-day Saints, some not so Orthodox, but most are practicing. That was the demographic. And so I gave my presentation on race, and I finished, and I thought, oh my goodness, he's never going to want me back. I was just too open. Anyway, afterwards, he writes me an email, we loved it, we want you back. And that happened 3 times, and each time I spoke to his group, I thought that I was just a little too forthright and maybe, not appropriate for that audience, and that wasn't true at all. What it taught me about that experience is that Latter-day Saints are just craving transparency. They're craving an honest history. They don't want things that are sugar-coated, artificial sweeteners, rationalizations. They don't want any of that stuff. And so that's the first story I want to share. The second story that I want to share is when the BYU Religion Department invited me to speak to their department last year, and I thought to myself, it was a faculty member who reached out, and I remember walking across campus, and I felt like, I don't know, what's the right term? I feel like I didn't belong maybe because of the topic and the tough subject. I felt like I needed a trench coat and glasses and a bowler hat, looking to my right and my left, And anyway, so I walk in, and the first person that greets me with a big old hug is the dean. And, hello, Brother Harris, so good to see you. And I said, okay, that's great. I'm glad that he knows I'm here. And anyway, but I thought there would be a critique of my book, and which is what academics do. I was prepared for that. I was welcoming it. This is, again, this sort of intellectual conversation. And when I got into the discussion, it was just the exact opposite. It wasn't that at all. It was about how do we do better? How do we teach race better with our students? We read your book. Oh, the dean bought copies of my book for the faculty. And I thought to myself, what good use of taxpayer dollars? i.e. tithe dollars. Anyway, so they bought my book and they read it. And I was just so thrilled to have a really honest and gratifying conversation about not sugarcoating race. These are folks on the front lines. They're teaching young kids. They have challenging questions. They're tired of the whitewashing stuff. And so they asked me, and one of the faculty said, look, this is what I got a question 3 days ago in class. It was something about curses in the Book of Mormon. And he said, you've got 20 minutes, go. Pretend you're me in class. I thought, oh my goodness. So I passed it off to my good friend Paul Reeve. I said, I have a friend who has a great book. And anyway, but jokes aside, Paul's book is wonderful because it was written for moments like this. It's a desert book publication. And I told the faculty, I said, I would steer your student to that book because you really can't have a really meaningful conversation in 15 minutes and then the bell rings and you've got to go to your next class. Have them read that book and then come back and see you. And I said, there's a little bit, oh, wow, I read the book. There's some tough things in there, one of the faculty said. And I said, well, I want to hear someone in the upper ups tell you that you cannot assign a desert book publication written for that audience to your students. I defiantly wanted to say that. And so when Desert Book decided to publish Paul's book, that's a huge, huge moment, I think, because Paul doesn't hold back, and it's written for this moment, written for these students. So anyway, there are people in the church, including the BYU Religion Department, people who work for seminaries and institutes. They're on the front lines. They know there's a problem with race. They're addressing it. They're doing their best. And I think that's so encouraging. One other thought, lots of stories I could share, but one other story that I want to share with you is a friend of mine about a year ago called me and he said, you'll never guess where I was. And I can't. Where were you? I was at Elder Holland's house. So he's good friends with Jeff Holland, the late Jeff Holland. And I said, okay. He said, when I walked in, he was reading Second Class Saints, your book. And I said, oh, that's pretty good. And I said, well, what did he think? He said it was painful, but it was necessary. That was Elder Holland's words to my friend. And I know firsthand that another apostle has read my book because I've heard from him. And I can tell you that some of the leaders are aware of these kinds of things. The fact that they're reading some of these challenging books, I think, is important. And I would also say, if some of you were thinking, why don't we have more change or more activism from the higher ups than we do? Because the answer is the quorum of the top 15, the two top quorums, they function like a brotherhood. They have to have unanimity, they have to agree. And the two apostles reading my book, and I know they've read others, they certainly want more traction along these issues. But the problem is then you get some of the other leaders who have different life experiences and they don't feel the need to act on these kinds of things. And some of you are, if you're keeping score at home, maybe Brother Uchtdorf will be the church president one day. Maybe he'll be the one to take that and push it forward. But there is progress being done, most of it locally, but sometimes at the top. We do get setbacks with stuff that Paul pointed out, the we don't know stuff in the manual. I mean, that is just, I'm just going to be frank, that is so offensive to suggest that we have answers in the church for everything that's really significant when it comes to salvific rites and ordinances. But somehow when millions of people have been denied those said rites and rituals for centuries, that we don't know the answer. I mean, that's just a way of saying we don't want to deal with something that's uncomfortable. But I do know there's traction to start to deal with these kinds of things, and it starts by having conversations first. And the fact that a couple of apostles are reading my book, the fact that the religion department has invited me in to have these tough conversations, the fact that Desert Book published Paul's book, I think is extraordinary, and I think it's a step in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you both. Well, in that spirit of wanting to continue the conversation, I want to go right away to opening up to your questions. I know there were many people having questions. Oh, down here first, and then we'll go to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sylvia Cavis. I'm a member of the Capitol Hill Ward, the One True Ward, Washington, D.C. If anyone is looking for a good research topic in global Mormonism, I suggest Mormons and the Peace Corps, because I think there are a lot of fascinating elements to discover. I am a member also of the small Mormon mafia in international development. Ann Sorensen is over there. There's a number of us, USAID and an international NGO community who talk about these issues exactly. And one of the questions that we grapple with is the church a global church or an Americanizing church. And I think of my time in Nairobi when I was a member of a branch, which is now the stake center for their temple, where during my time there, there was a change in the language policy. And I feel like the language policy is one way that the church colonialism manifests itself, where the fatwa came down, I don't know, from Salt Lake or elsewhere, everything had to be in English. And you could imagine in a ward that pulled from every neighborhood in Nairobi, that created a socioeconomic divide between the educated folks who spoke English and the not as educated folks who spoke Kiswahili. And the first Fast and Testimony Sunday afterwards, people would go up and say in Kiswahili, "I'm sorry, I cannot bear my testimony in English." And I don't think that's the spirit that this language policy was intended to have. And my second question, which is more pertinent to the US, is how to find and promote anti-racism curricula that aligns with church standards. And I'm thinking specifically of two that I know of. In 2021, there was a course on uprooting racism and white supremacy as LDS sisters with Dr. Jennifer Keys Adair. And in 2024, there was a course called Intersecting Identities and Experiences with Race, Faith, and Gender with Dr. LaShawn Williams. So how do we convince our local leadership or our higher leadership that number one, this is needed, and number two, there are resources that we could use that do not conflict with church teachings and doctrine? Thank you.
Go ahead. The church will always have an American element.
The prophet Joseph Smith was born here. We had the vision here. This is something that's not going away. So I think we need to establish that. It started as an American church, and we need to acknowledge that. That being said, from my point of view, we are an international church. We're not a global church, not yet. There's a pastor in Switzerland who's American, and he was asked to run a global church in Switzerland, a congregation. And these were all people of different ethnicities and race, different languages. I think there was like 15 languages even within that place. And he was asked to be the pastor. And the committee, and of course, they get paid, and that's very different from our church. But they told him, yes, you will be the spiritual leader, you will be there to help, and you will be there you're the pastor, so that's your responsibility and so forth. But we have a committee, and every year we have a president that we elect every year. And it's gonna be one of us. So even though you are welcome as the pastor, it's gonna be one member from different race and ethnicity that will get a turn. I think that's where we say we're a global church. It's not when we're just at the table or we're token, but we're also been in a position of leadership. And we're having meaningful changes and we're having hard conversations. Yes, we have church leaders who are from different countries, and we're seeing that on the African continent and so forth. But they tend to kind of stop by the 70s. And then there's not too much going on at the top. So I think we need to acknowledge that, no, we're not a global faith, not yet. For sure we're not. We're not there yet.
Other questions? You were waiting to ask one before, weren't you, Robert? Yeah.
Well, I guess one of the first things I want to say is just what this gentleman brought up earlier. Is of course there's racism in America. When I became a member of the church, I had a Baptist friend of mine who was a preacher, a Baptist preacher, said, "Robert, you know there's racism in that church." I said, "Well, I live in America." So, so for me, the idea that I would join the LDS church and then find out that there was racism in it, it was like I faced racism in the Navy, I faced racism at AT&T. It's America. So it kind of frustrated me in that sense that some people would come into the church and all of a sudden realize there's racism and then we need to leave. because we was losing people in Atlanta, Georgia all the time, especially men, because we needed the priesthood holders, and the men would come into the church and then they found out about the racism, and within a year, all of that priesthood base we thought that we was building is gone, simply because we didn't address it on the front end. Because afterwards, it's not that you deceived me, you lied to me, is what many of them would say, okay? And so I find that a lot of times, it's not the naivety of black folks coming into the church, or Indians or Native Americans, it's the naivety of the membership. Because the membership is not being taught the truth of where this racism comes from. Therefore, when it's time to address the truth, we always get, I don't know. So it's naivety on the membership's part, not on those people. I grew up in Georgia. I know what racism is, right? So, but I think in all of this, when we talk about religion, the most important base that we miss from this new thing of racism, which is less than 500 years old, perhaps 600 years old, because this doesn't exist until the last several centuries, is that we're ignoring the economics that built this. Going to Mike Shields' department here at UVA, it's about the money. Because when you go to the Caribbean, all of Europe is being supported out of slavery in the Caribbean. All of that money that built England and Spain and Portugal and all these people, that came from the Caribbean. Then they built those products that they took out of the Caribbean and they sold them to the United States, because that's where people were. We've always been spenders in the United States. So they took that Caribbean wealth and they spread it to the United States. So we cannot talk about religion without talking about economics, because the religion was used to usurp, the business used religion to exert people. So when we talk about racism in the LDS church, we're talking about white people getting rich off of the world and using the excuse that my Lord and Savior said I am justified, and suppressing other people of the world. You find that in England, where they killed and murdered 3 million people. In Ghana, where they murdered 10 million people. United States, where they murdered 2 million people. Enslaved over 10 million people. So we can't keep talking about religion until we understand that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Church of Jesus Christ, all Christian denominators, have been usurped by business to have what they want. When we start looking at the economics of it, we have to address as Latter-day Saints, how do we get ourselves from under the thumb of this economic pressure that justifies using religion to justify our hatred of other people? Because all of this, as far as I'm concerned, is about money. When you look at the South and slavery, it's about money and using Christianity as the justification for slavery, right? And using that instrument to create something that didn't exist. And this starts as far back as 1453, when you look at Gomez Zerara, the former chief chronicler of the Kingdom of Portugal. He's going out recording history in what he called the discovery and conquest of Guinea in 1453. And he's talking about the debarkation of slaves off of a Portuguese ship, white people, mulatto people, black people. And the white people are described as heavenly sent. They're slaves, but these are good-looking, strong people. Then you had the mixed race people in between, and then at the bottom was these loathsome, ugly black folks. So this economic language that we have is at least as old as 14 years old. And it continues to everything. But let me get off my soapbox, I'm sorry. But how do we get the church from the stance of emphasizing black people and people of color faith into them speaking of stop mistreating others? They're asking us to be faithful, but at church they never seem to address that you shouldn't be racist in the first place, and therefore I should not have to be faithful in overcoming if you would just stop being racist.
Well, I would say, Robert, it's a function of not, I mean, as Paul puts it, not doing enough to root out racism. Rhetoric is one thing, and actions are quite another. And in my opinion, if the church was really serious about rooting out racism, I don't mean this as a criticism, I think it's just an observation. But if the church, if they were serious about rooting out racism, they'd have entire lessons to these kinds of things. And the lesson would be called, you know you're a racist if you do these 10 things. I mean, because it's one of those things like, you know, go make the bed. Well, I'm not sure how to make the bed. Well, here are 10 steps to make the bed. I think that this is where we're at. Because most people in the Latter-day Saint community, I mean, you know, if it's driven by political racism, which is what I'm arguing, then most of these folks don't think that they're racist. They just don't, and they don't understand the behavior. And I think I'm just, you know, every time I get a chance to say this in public, at public meetings, particularly if there's a leader in the church, I'll say stuff like the church needs racial sensitivity training by people skilled in that particular skill set. And if the church were serious about it, they would devote priesthood and Relief Society lessons to it. There would be sermons in General Conference. There'd be publications by both church leaders, perhaps, and non-church leaders in church publications. But it's just a function, I think, of a lot of people in the church who don't want to address it because it's uncomfortable. Two, it reminds a lot of people of a theology that was never part of the gospel, as Stephen puts it, right? And then thirdly, I think there's just a lot of people who just don't know how to address it, even though they know that there's a problem.
Can I just, in terms of, I have to be very careful what I say of this. Yeah, I'm going to speak as, even though I'm a naturalized U.S. citizen, but I'm going to speak as a global perspective. American politics is killing the church globally. That's what it is. American politics is killing the church globally.
Yeah, that's it.
And what I mean by this is, I mean, we just gave this example. We hear, and we talked about most of the members here are probably progressive and liberal. And yet, we need to be having this conversation with Americans who feel, for them, they are conservative. And in so many ways, we've put also both parties, or however you want to call it, as enemies. And so how do you address racism in the church globally if one group feels that you're making me the evil guy? And how would that work? How do you, I don't know, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about it. How do you get past the American politics to talk about racism? Because it's not just in the US, it's everywhere. And so is this just one country that's going to dominate the scene when it comes to global Mormonism? We talk about the church being global. That's why I said it's international, yes. It has many parts of different parts of the world, yes, absolutely. But we're not global.
I don't understand what you mean. I don't know what definitions you have in your mind
Yeah.
when you're saying that.
So international would mean you have different wards and state, you have temples in many countries, but it's still run, everything is through Salt Lake, through the church headquarters. Yes, there's some part where you have area authorities that are in different continents, but at the end, you're still having 15 senior leaders that are oftentimes are Caucasian, are from Utah, or Pioneer Heritage. There's nothing wrong with that, but you're still having that same thing. And perspective is different, and that's why I talked about trauma and triggers. Because for me, I don't have any problem calling the Prophet Brigham Young a prophet, and also he had racist attitudes. That does not differ my testimony. I don't have any problem with that. We believe in the gift, a theology of repentance. Of course, there are things that's happening on the other side. So I don't have any problem with that. But I do think because the church leaders are so scared of politics in the United States that they kind of stall everything, and that we just kind of play the game. We'll do a little bit, if something happens in the US when it comes to racism or anything in different parts of the world, we'll see statements being issued by the church. But that's about it, right? It's like, we're gonna stay neutral, we're gonna play the game politically correct. But no more than that. And part of it is American Latter-day Saints who are Caucasian, whether they are Democrats or Republican, I couldn't care less. The problem is that they're the one who are dominating the scene. You don't hear saints of color in the US. Just yesterday, I was listening to Sister Freeman giving the interview about the change of name for young women. And she made this comment. She said, when that name change happened, I was looking through all the social media and I was reading all the comments, and I stayed up past midnight. I know those comments are coming from American Latter-day Saints, and oftentimes they're Caucasian. They're not Latinos. They're not African. They're not going to be any of these women of color. It's so even in the terms of the social media, that's also where the conversation is always. It's between progressive and conservative Americans. So you want to talk about racism, we have to address maybe this part, this ugly part of our history, but also today. If we're going to say we're going to become a global faith, you have to address this.
I had promised. I had promised you a comment.
Thank you. And
Yes.
I'd love to ask mine, and I hope I have time.
Yeah.
But I also want to recognize that she's
Good.
had her hand up for a while.
Oh, good. I'm
So
sorry. I
let's let
can't.
her
It's
go.
harder to see you over there. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I think I have two questions. I have one for you, Vina, and I have one for you, Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, you read my mind because I was going to ask this question the first time. Vina, I think I really appreciate the speaking on the experiences of people of color. But I think we've seen the tension in this conversation, right, with the questions that people have asked about, was the ban against Chinese people? Was it against Fijians? And Dr. Reeves and Dr. Harrison, specifically targeted towards members of African descent. And so my question is, how do we hold space, right, for the experiences of racism that people of color do face in the church, while also recognizing that racism isn't maybe a sufficient analytic to think about the priesthood ban, that anti-Blackness might be a better way to think about it because of the way that it specifically targets Black people, Black skin. The closer you are to Blackness, the further you are from whiteness. And how even thinking about brown skin is cursed because it's in proximity to Black skin. And so, how do we hold space for those experiences while also not conflating that it's not all people of color have the same experiences, because it was a ban against anti-Black. It was an anti-Black ban. And then Dr. Harris, my question for you also is, I do think there have been changes in the church in terms of talking more about race. But I will say, I was at BYU 10 years ago, and these same things were happening, where they were inviting people, Dr. Reeves, coming in, talking about his book, religious leaders talking about, and I visited BYU last year, and it felt worse than when I was there. And I struggled at BYU, and it feels even worse, right? We talked about Dr. Rue, who, one of the sociology of race professors at BYU, who had his office vandalized multiple times because of the things that he posted on his doors, and they had to install security cameras on the sociology hallway, right? Because people were removing signs and posters that were affirmative to marginalized people. And then I'm glad you mentioned social media too, where there is this Gen Z, it's like these two sides of Gen Z that you often find are very progressive, but then you have this rise of Christian nationalism among American youth. this rise of like what I'm writing about in my dissertation, trad wives, right? This turn to conservatism and this turn to fascism is how does the church, how do you see any hope in the church navigating race when there is this rise of Christian nationalism? And I wonder even for you, Dr. Reed, whether you see this being a second wave of what you've wrote in Religion of a Different Color, this desire to aspire for whiteness, that you turn so strongly to Christian nationalism because there's been like an increase of anti-Mormonism, or there's such a desire to claim Mormonism as Christians, or this sacred project of Mormonism being an American project, right? The New Jerusalem is going to be in America. Like how very deeply tied America is to this project of the church is to this project of America's. How do you even navigate hope for any changes against anti-Blackness when there is this rise of Christian nationalism among youth that I see all the time online, all the time on Twitter, all the time on Instagram? That is just disgusting, right? I'm not sure there has been these great changes that we probably are discussing. Right? There is this alarming rise among Mormon youth, Mormon white young boys and young girls who have an invested interest in maintaining whiteness and maintaining anti-Blackness in the church. And how does the church navigate that, even though there are these ideas that this ban is over? How do you navigate that in this current political climate?
Small questions. Wow. Well, thank you. Are there some quick answers that anyone wants to?
I'll say a quick one. Or go ahead. Go ahead.
So you asked a question about colored people and black people, and I'm glad you brought it up because that was part of my slide and I didn't. In Mauritius, I grew up Catholic, and Indians are the majority, they're Hindus. And the next religious majority is Catholicism, and it's mostly Creole, African descent. So I grew up in this in-between space where when I went to do catechism, I didn't look black enough. I was Indian, and also Hindus control the island. There's hegemony, very definitely in Mauritius on that aspect. So anytime I've had African or Creole friends in the Catholic Church, they didn't like me because it reminded them of their oppression, what they were going through. And then when I would be among the Hindus, because I was Christian, they also didn't like me because I betrayed the Hindu faith. I had converted for a piece of baguette or rice. That's what they would say. Wow. And so having been in the in-between, never feeling fit in any space, I've also seen that as a strength because I've known pain from the beginning. And you're never part of one thing. And so when I talk, for my dissertation, when I talk about the Creole people, I know the history of slavery and I know what they went through. And I also am very aware of the Indians who are the majority, who will always have a prime minister who's North Indian. There will never be another ethnicity. And that's also part of who I am. When I did an interview of an African, a Creole leader, and there was one question that I asked him, and he's known me for a long time. And I said, well, why do you think the church is not flourishing as much in Mauritius? And I could see he was very uncomfortable. He didn't know what to tell me, how to tell me. And then he just said, okay, I'm gonna tell you this because you're a Latter-day Saint first. And he said it's just because of Hindus. There's too many Hindus. And what I'm trying to say is, speaking about racism in terms of blackness or brownness, we just have to talk about it. I'm acutely aware that I'm a South Indian woman. I have privileges. I am the model minority in the United States. That's how Asian are perceived. I'm very aware of that. And I talk about it. And I also talk about it because I'm Indian and I can say whatever I want about my ethnicity. That's mine, I own it. And I think that's what we need to teach children of whatever ethnicity they are in the church. Own the history of your friend and also own yours, the ugly and the beautiful. I tell my kids the same thing. I said, you live in North Carolina, but if you're driving as opposed to somebody else who's African American, guess who is gonna be favored? And for my kids, it's a pause moment because they are in a church in North Carolina where it's all white and they're only brown. And so for them also, they have to recognize privileges. And I don't know how the church will do that, honestly. I think this is something parents should know and should be teaching their children. But if we don't talk about it, if we don't share those examples, I share those examples when I'm teaching Institute at Duke and UNC. I share it in Relief Society when I teach. I know I make people uncomfortable, but I also want to tell them I'm here. I acknowledge my privilege. I acknowledge also part of me that I know I've been discriminated. Why can't you do the same? Why can't you have both? Why can't you embrace both? And this is where we need leaders to show that example. I think that's where we're lacking senior leaders to showcase those examples.
Thank you. We are over time, but I have been promising you that you were going to get a chance to ask a question, so you get the last question.
I hope my question lives up to you. First of all, may I just say thank you to all of you, especially thank you. Thank you to the four of you who have dedicated yourself to academic research in this space. But you are rays of light, I think, at a much needed time. So I just really appreciate that. My question is a hypothetical. The four of you are put on a plane tonight to go to Salt Lake. Tomorrow morning, you are meeting with the General Sunday School Presidency who say, good news, we want to put together a Sunday school curriculum around priesthood, the racial ban, and how to root out racism. All four of you are hesitant to do it, so they capitulate and say each of you can have one topic that is a non-negotiable to write into the lesson material. So my question for all four of you is, what is your topic to include? And number two, do you put this curriculum out just to the US or to the entire world in the church?
We're going to do a quick round robin on that. Alice?
We're going to go through the four of you. Okay. We can start at the other end. Paul?
So I assign Brigham Young's February 1852 speech and Orson Pratt's two anti-slavery speeches. We have no proof that Africans are descendants of Cain, Orson Pratt says, in 1856. The only rationale Brigham Young ever gives. So I want that included in the curriculum. I want everyone to read those speeches and become aware this was not uncontested territory in the beginning, right? Very much contested.
Excellent. Anyone else have a?
Wow. I would say, let's see. I would say I'd probably do the church statements that the church has produced on race. There's been a handful. One from 1949 where the theories and postulates that come down through the years are codified in this first presidency statement. I would probably talk and learn from that. 1969, this whole we don't know line that we've been skeptical of today, that is part of a public relations statement from 1969 during the midst of the civil rights era, where the leaders will say in private, hey, we believe in the curse and less valiance, but we can't tell the public that because they don't understand it. So let's just say we don't know. So we would learn from that. And I would, of course, we would read official manifesto number 2, which is as it's put, the priesthood revelation declaration. And then finally, I would end with race and priesthood and let people know that there's been an evolution of thinking. And we're not where we need to be when this statement came out in 2013, But it does show a remarkable evolution, and the point would be that it's not to pat anybody on the back, it's to suggest that we still have more evolving. And we've heard some of those answers today where we need to be. And I would just say one last thing. You didn't ask this, but I'm going to put it in. P.S. We need more color in the top leadership. That's critical to making us become an international to a global church. We have to have different perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I would assign all women of color stories. I've assigned her reading in my class, World Religion, on Alice, her experience. I would assign about Indian women, how they're dealing with caste in the church in India. I would assign about Latina women here with a conversation with in their wards. I would assign where women of color would talk about their different privileges and also what they've seen. All oral history and stories.
Nice.
Yeah.
Wow. Great curriculum.
That's great.
Okay, I can't get it down to one. Sorry. I would assign Paul's book, Let's Talk About Race in the Priesthood, as a manual to follow, required reading. And then I'm going to steal from you, Matthew. You know I do that all the time. What he's talking about, we know how to do it. You know how to make a bed. Here are the steps to how to make a bed. Here are the steps to removing racism. I would put in, this is what racism looks like. Are you doing blank? This is racism. Are you doing blank? Stop it! No, this is racism. Are you doing blank? And just step by step, I just give this list of this is what racism looks like, because that way it can include what it looks like in other countries, among other people, because what is called casteism there can be termed as racism.
It is.
So, well, that's the whole book of caste is based on that. And so I would do a step by step like that, and not just have it as required reading, but have it be something that you go over in class, and every student has to answer this, do this survey, and then has to go to the bishop or the branch president and go over it with that leader and sit down, every single person. And everybody in the ward or branch is required to do this and sit before their priesthood leader, similar to a kind of temple recommend interview. Oh man, okay, 3. There's got to be questions in the temple recommend interview. I can't do one.
That's interesting.
I'm sorry.
That's good. That's good.
No, that's great.
That's good.
This is after all the leadership has gone through Matt's training. I think that this only reflects the need for more conversations like this. So I want to thank all of you for being here and for asking such great questions. I want us all to thank our panelists for all the wonderful things that they have had to say. So please.